Welcome to the chaos sector. We return to the Matrix. I think everyone has come to the conclusion that Vice President Kamala Harris has conceded defeat in this presidential campaign. With less than a month to go before the next president is elected, we have watched Harris crumble on a national stage. It's quite embarrassing for Democrats. I would even suggest that Harris's interviews and guest appearances have been more embarrassing than an old man forgetting his train of thought, falling on the steps to Air Force One, falling off his bicycle. He's an old man. Old Joe and Jill are sitting on the couch, pointing at the 60 Minutes interview on television, saying, heck, I could have done way better than that. And I can't even remember what year it is. And that's what we will be discussing this episode. Before we get into that, there are whispers going around that suggest Old Joe is trying to undermine Harris's presidential bid. Furthermore, there were reports prior that also suggested they didn't really coexist too well. We knew they didn't because bad grandkids get on their grandparents' nerves. Remember, even though Old Joe is a senior citizen who's barely coherent, he is not a progressive. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, is in fact a progressive. Well, a bit more of a mouthpiece for progressives, as she's very hollow if we break it down. The point, though, is behind the scenes there were talks that Harris and Old Joe didn't really get along due to views on policies and ideals. If this were the case, then everything presented about this administration in regards to compatibility has been a complete lie. Of course, but Old Joe's recent statements are not an accident, claiming they were singing from the same song sheet. Harris was right there supporting all the decisions, policies, and economic plans. This is outing Harris, just like he was outed. Dirty political game, right? He is intentionally keeping Harris glued to his hip as she tries to sneak out the back door and transform into a different candidate. The problem with that transformation is it's artificially generated by the mainstream media. They created this vibrant, new blooming candidate who rises out of the shadows of the old man. Well, Harris has had plenty of time to confirm that transformation, but instead, there has been nothing but awkward silence in the room. Here's an example.
It's gone viral, of course, the proverbial brain fart of teleprompter malfunctions. But the problem here is that Kamala Harris isn't sure which direction she should be going without the teleprompter. Most politicians can quickly adjust to that malfunction and speak to the crowd in a span of time that aligns with the message that was on the teleprompter. For example, Harris was reading from the teleprompter regarding, I don't know, let's say the economy. She was in the middle of explaining how she will cut taxes for the lower and middle class, and then bam, it goes out on her. Well, since she knows her economic plan, there's nothing to worry about. Just speak about the plan a bit more in depth, aligning that with what is being presented from your teleprompter. Simple as it gets. You don't have to be the smoothest to do that. But if you're talking about your economic plan, which actually isn't your plan, when the teleprompter goes out, your brain shuts down because, there was nothing there to begin with without the teleprompter. In other words, her brain was depending on the information on the teleprompter. I know it sounds a bit rough, but this is the awkward silence at that rally. Her facial expression displayed one of the most frightened individuals when facing that malfunction. And the fear is not really about the teleprompter itself. It's the fear of actually not having anything substantial or even tangible to say to the American people. You have to remember, the rally is not just for those in attendance. The rally is also to speak to the nation. This is why Donald Trump keeps drawing large crowds at his rallies, because they won't be a part of that energy. They actually like when he goes off on his own. It's a devastating contrast between human and robot. Trump looks awkward reading a teleprompter. He has a greater impact when he goes off script, while Harris looks awkward away from the teleprompter as she lacks the social skills to communicate with everyday people. Because she has a cold and shallow demeanor, which doesn't resonate with the people. And on top of those selfish characteristics, Harris is very hollow when it comes to intellectual and political depth. And that lack of depth, the depth of being a well-rounded politician who can generate excitement and policies at the same time, was on full display in those seconds, which must have felt like 15 minutes to Harris. We internalized that silence, and it was someone who literally has no business running for president, and the crowd also felt that silence. We could even suggest that if it continued for just a bit longer, you may have heard a few boos in the crowd that might be on its way in the next rally she has. She is a high school principal, not a vice president. Anyway, let's get into the interview.
Let's get started. We will be analyzing the interview from the transcript as the team has done prior. 60 Minutes, Bill Whitaker interviews Harris. And I will say that it was a soft scrutiny. And just that touch of scrutiny led to Harris showing visible frustration. Whitaker, quote, "The events of the past few weeks have pushed us to the brink, if not into an all-out regional war in the Middle East. What can the U.S. do at this point to stop this from spinning out of control?" Harris, quote, "Well, let's start with October 7th. 1,200 people were massacred, 250 hostages were taken, including Americans. Women were brutally raped. And as I said then, I maintain Israel has a right to defend itself. We would, and how it does so matters. Far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. This war has to end. Okay, let's stop right here." In the beginning of the interview, Harris has already crumbled. We're not going to get into the issue in depth because there's complexities there. But what we will focus on is how this administration hasn't done anything about the tension that exists in the United States. Palestinians and Jewish people are having turmoil right in the front yard, on college campuses and communities, and this administration hasn't done anything about it. So it's kind of hard for Harris to give any sort of strategic plan when this administration isn't dealing with a similar conflict in the United States, which is on a microscopic scale compared to the war in the Middle East. But there is an indication that Harris is in favor of Palestine, which doesn't bode well when it comes to being allies with Israel. If you recall, Harris ditched the congressional speech of the Prime Minister to attend a sorority event. That showed that Harris doesn't have the concern for attending such a very important meeting with one of the U.S.'s strongest allies. And even more so, this is coming during a time she was actively campaigning for president. It was a very bad look and somewhat a cold shoulder to the Prime Minister as well. Let's continue though. Whitaker, quote, "We supply Israel with billions of dollars in military aid, and yet Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be charting his own course. The Biden-Harris administration has pressed him to agree to ceasefire. He's resisted. You urged him not to go into Lebanon. He went anyway. Does the U.S. have no sway over Prime Minister Netanyahu?" Harris, quote, "The work that we do diplomatically with the leadership of Israel is an ongoing pursuit around making clear our principles." Wait, she's digging herself into a very deep hole here. Again, going back to the congressional speech. Keep in mind, at the time of that speech, Kamala Harris, the vice president, had already been nominated as the new Democratic candidate for president. The Prime Minister, of course, knew of this, and when she decided to ditch the speech, it gave insight to how she would deal with foreign policies and relations. And that would be to dismiss the Prime Minister of Israel to go have fun at a sorority event. Apparently, Joe Biden couldn't make her attend neither, as he was missing in action after he stepped down. So the optics showed the Prime Minister that Harris was in fact in charge. She would not support him and his efforts to resolve the Middle Eastern conflict. Let's continue though. Whitaker, quote, "But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening." Harris, quote, "We are not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end." All right, so Harris has shown, for one, she doesn't respect the Prime Minister. Two, she is speaking on behalf of the United States, which she doesn't have the credibility to do. And third, she is actually ratcheting up more tension by displaying such a dismissive tone. Israel is not innocent in that war, but if that is your ally, you stand behind them. If you can't negotiate on their wrongdoings, then, well, to be honest, perhaps there is a lack of leadership. Because despite the fiery temperature that Donald Trump brought about, the war in the Middle East hadn't reached this level. Sure, we can say it was inevitable, but it's how leadership handles a situation involving one of their allies. And we can suggest that Mike Pence, as vice president, wouldn't have ditched the congressional speech by that ally's leader. Let's continue though. Whitaker, quote, "Do we have a real close ally in Prime Minister Netanyahu?" Harris, quote, "I think with all due respect, the better question is, do we have an important alliance between the American people and the Israeli people?" And the answer to that is yes. Okay, they should have ended the interview or cut and re-edit, because this was a slap in the face to the Prime Minister by saying, quote, "With all due respect." This translates to "with all due disrespect" to the Prime Minister, as Harris overlooks his leadership, essentially putting the alliance in potential jeopardy. She should not be in the position to speak on behalf of the United States. This is a very horrific mistake. She has no experience in foreign relations and doesn't think beyond her scope of the United States, in contrast to the rest of the world. Meaning, Harris doesn't truly grasp the political climates around the world, and how an interview such as this by a vice president of one of the world's powers can agitate world leaders into viewing the United States in an inauspicious manner. It's unbelievable that this is potentially the next president. Imagine a President Kamala Harris having this same interview. She could potentially agitate even more wars just off her statements and tone. Anyway, I'll let my colleagues take it from here.
Well, it's just another example of someone put in a position that they weren't qualified for. Trump was inexperienced, of course, but he was politically engaged prior to running, and he was a businessman who had foreign relations with many world leaders. Rough around the edges, not afraid to speak his mind. His lack of experience politically was balanced out with his knowledge of business, finances, which applies to the economy, and his relations with world leaders, which applies to a better grasp of foreign relations and policies. Kamala Harris does not have any experience in business, which makes it hard for her to explain an economic plan. She does not have any experience in foreign relations, which makes it hard for her to explain a foreign policy. And this is the result: a vice president who is potentially agitating one of the US's strongest allies in Israel. If she had attended that congressional speech by the Prime Minister, it would have shown leadership. It would have ensured that the United States stands as a strong ally with Israel. Instead, she decides to skip that speech and party with sororities. Also, while the Prime Minister was speaking, there were members of Congress protesting against Netanyahu's congressional speech and outside causing violence. And where was the Vice President who had become the Democratic presidential candidate at that time? Dancing and prancing in another state, avoiding accountability. If you want to be taken seriously, if you want to obtain the most powerful seat in government, then you attend the congressional speech by one of your allies to show strength, leadership, and support. Let's continue. Whitaker asked Harris about her economic plan. Quote, "There are lots of signs that the American economy is doing very well, better than most countries, I think." Hold on, let's not do that, Mr. Whitaker. The economy is doing horrible under this administration. With the rise of inflation, the American people aren't able to consistently afford or purchase items that they could prior. So they are not circulating the dollar back into the economy. Whitaker knows that. But he is serving up a softball here to see if Harris can make good contact. Anywho, but the American people don't seem to be feeling it. Groceries are 25% higher, and people are blaming you and Joe Biden for that. Are they wrong? Harris responds, quote, "We now have historic low unemployment in America among all groups of people. We now have an economy that is thriving by all macroeconomic measures." Stop, just stop. First of all, macroeconomics is a term added to her vocabulary to sound as if she has knowledge on the subject. You're only making yourself look less knowledgeable when you add words that you never used before in discussing economics. Second, again, this misleading claim about low unemployment. Stop doing that. The majority of jobs created, literally created, not recovered, have been created from the federal government. Those are jobs, yes, but they mislead people when they use that large percentage of public sector jobs being created and take credit for private sector jobs. When you think about private sector jobs, you think about lower class to middle class workers in America. These are the bulk of the economy, and they are also the bulk of consumers. And, of course, they are the bulk of people spending 25% more for groceries. Quote, "And to your point, prices are still too high. And I know that, and we need to deal with it, which is why part of my plan, you mentioned groceries. Part of my plan is what we must do to bring down the price of groceries." Okay, here's the problem. Whitaker asked a question about the American citizens blaming Harris and old Joe for paying 25% more for groceries. He asked, are they wrong for blaming them? Harris does not take accountability for it. She addresses it as if inflation just magically came out of left field, and now she will fight to tackle that problem. It's your responsibility along with your boss. You stood alongside him and signed all of those bills. Both of you are responsible for inflation that has caused those economic hardships for the American people. Since you're being interviewed, basically to be hired as the next president, you don't deflect from a question the interviewer has about your work experience. You take responsibility for it. But what do you expect with corrupt politicians? Let's keep going. Whitaker then states, quote, "You want to give tax breaks to first-time home buyers." Harris responds, quote, "Yes." Whitaker, quote, "And the people starting small businesses." Harris, quote, "Correct." Whitaker, quote, but it is estimated by the Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget that your economic plan would add $3 trillion to the federal deficit over the next decade. How are you going to pay for that? Okay, let's stop right here. This is a great question. You know why that's a great question? Because it forces Harris to explain how she will pay for all of her economic proposals. That's all people have been waiting to hear from her. Just explain your proposals in depth. Harris responds, quote, okay, so the other economist, she stuttered there, but the other economists that have reviewed my plan versus my opponent and determined that my economic plan would strengthen America's economy. His would weaken it. And there you have it. She has once again failed to explain the plan. Whitaker didn't ask you which economic plan is better, yours or Trump's. He asked you how are you going to pay for your economic plan. You see? But she can't explain her economic plan because, to be frank, it's not her plan. Of course, presidents have a team around them that help with their policies. But Harris has shown, based on her responses, that she has very little input on whatever is being drafted up behind closed doors. I would even suggest that she has no input on economic roundtable discussions. Her job is to just go out and prance around. And it's evident here in how she is dodging the question. Whitaker responds, and Harris then interrupts, quote, my plan, Bill, if you don't mind. My plan is about saying that when you invest in small businesses, you invest in the middle class, and you strengthen America's economy. Small businesses are part of the backbone of America's economy. Wow, this is a bit depressing. She can't articulate a message because she is ignorant on the subject matter. Examine her response. Quote, my plan is about saying that this type of fragmented speech is the result of a fragmented thought, which is a fragmented brain. My plan is about saying? So, your plan is about you saying you will invest in small businesses. You see how incoherent this sounds? Even if your plan sucks to high hell, if you're articulate, or at least have knowledge of the subject, you'll be able to explain that horrible plan in a coherent way. But not only does her plan suck, Harris can't even explain it coherently because she doesn't have the knowledge. It isn't her plan neither, and she's just not that smart, to be honest. So, this is the most humiliating presidential candidate I have ever seen. It's very cringe listening to her speak at such an elementary level. And everyone criticizes Trump for speaking in a childish manner, but when it comes to policies or the serious issues, all of that childish banter goes out the window. Let's try to finish. Whitaker then tries to get his question in, and Harris once again runs on and on. A quote, and I plan on making it fair. Whitaker responds, quote, but we're dealing with the real world here. Harris responds, quote, but the real world includes fragmented thought here. Whitaker then asked, quote, how are you going to get this through Congress? Harris responds, quote, when you talk quietly with a lot of folks in Congress, they know exactly what I'm talking about because their constituents know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, Whitaker doesn't know what the heck you're talking about, and you're sitting right in front of him discussing the issue. Explain it right now then, since there's a favorable consensus of your plan, right? Their constituents are those firefighters and teachers and nurses. Their constituents are middle-class, hard-working folk. And you haven't explained your economic plan in depth, which gives insight to how you'll get Congress to support you. That's what Whitaker is trying to pull out of her, like pulling teeth. So he tries to pull harder, to see if Harris will give him something. Quote, and Congress has shown no inclination to move in your direction. Harris responds, quote, I disagree with you. There are plenty of leaders in Congress who understand and know that the Trump tax cuts blew up our federal deficit. None of us, and certainly I cannot afford to be myopic in terms of how I think about strengthening America's economy. Let me tell you something. I am a devout public servant. You know that. I am also a capitalist. And I know the limitations of government. Harris, you are not a capitalist. You are a socialist. Everyone knows that. It's something her campaign has been trying to sweep under the rug, but it's already been exposed. And again, a Trump pivot. You claim that Whitaker is wrong about Congress, yet you do not provide evidence that Congress is actually supporting your economic plan. Just because they may disagree with Trump does not mean they support your economic plan, you see? But because she knows her economic plan would not pass in Congress, she reverts back to criticizing her opponent's plan to make hers look more effective, yet she hasn't elaborated on how she will propose this plan to Congress. In addition, Trump's tax cuts is something she criticized, claiming it increased the federal deficit. Misleading as always. When you give the people tax cuts, they have more money per pay cycle, which increases consumer spending, which brings back money into the Federal Reserve. This is why inflation was low, because the economy was stable, due to consumers circulating money back into the economy. Trump did, in fact, increase the federal deficit, but the American people were not suffering, and prices were not 20 to 50% higher for everyday consumer purchases. That's what she is not grasping. Here's the concept: you have to spend money to make money. It's a balanced business model. Harris wants to spend money, but not provide a return back on the investment, so it's just spending money recklessly. Her proposals will definitely hurt corporations and even small businesses as well. This hurts the economy, raises inflation even more, and it will also increase unemployment, as corporations will have staff cuts to combat the higher tax rates. In a fundamental perspective, trickle-down economics is effective when you have the right view of it. If you give tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations, then they have more money to pay higher wages for their employees, hire more employees, and generate more revenue due to a greater flow of services to the consumers. Ideally, it works. If you don't want to go that route, you can also give higher tax cuts for the lower and middle class, which would help them financially and also feed the American economy. More money for a corporation or wealthy investor, the likelihood that a corporation will create a subsidiary of that company, which expands employment opportunities for the citizens. For example, you have Walmart, right? Well, Walmart has a subsidiary in Sam's Club. With this company branching out from Walmart, it employs millions of Americans across the country. But if you raise taxes on a corporation such as Walmart, both Walmart and its subsidiary Sam's Club will be forced to make adjustments to those companies, which do not favor the American workers, the middle class that Harris is always claiming to fight for. She's just not that smart. No offense, but she shouldn't be in this position proposing economic policies that affect the American people.
Exactly, increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations sounds noble in how they frame it. The rich should pay their fair share and all. But if you noticed, we don't hear the left including the wealthy and rich Hollywood celebrities in that group, or other entertainers who are rich. It's some phantom group of, quote, spoiled wealthy individuals running around with billions of dollars. And of course corporations they put emphasis on. It's a socialist talking point that resonates with mainly young people. But the back end of their ideology is where the bottom drops out, because corporations and even wealthy individuals who are also businessmen and women, will definitely adapt to paying higher taxes. Corporations, as mentioned, will cut staff, cut hours, cut on manufacturing, which only hurts the American workers and the American consumers. Wealthy individuals who are also business owners will do the same at a more significant rate due to not having the same budget as the multimillion or even multi-billion-dollar corporations. Some may say, well, they make so much money, they can afford to pay their employees better wages. I agree with the core of that view, but they also have to budget, just like everyone else beneath them economically. McDonald's is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and they have increased wages for their employees. But not every corporation is as successful as McDonald's. So there may be a slight wage increase, but not a drastic level that will impact their profit margin. Overall, Harris's sentiment is one that everyone would agree with, but she doesn't truly grasp the consequences of dropping the hammer on corporations and the wealthy. But let's continue with the interview. Whitaker goes on to ask Harris about the border. Quote, "You recently visited the southern border and embraced President Biden's recent crackdown on asylum seekers. And that crackdown produced an almost immediate and dramatic decrease in the number of border crossings. Okay, we're going to just bypass this false claim by Whitaker. If that's the right answer now, why didn't your administration take those steps in 2021? Harris responds, quote, "The first bill we proposed to Congress was to fix our broken immigration system, knowing that if you want to actually fix it, we need Congress to act. Now, the question was why didn't you enforce these policies in 2021? And Harris simply ignored the question. It was a question that, questions if she is serious about upholding the law, as the so-called crackdown on asylum seekers wasn't executed when it needed to be done. She immediately blamed Congress, yet the president, with the support of the vice president, can sign an executive order to enforce such a policy, which is just enforcing the law that currently exists. Again, not taking accountability. Let's continue. Quote, "It was not taken up. Fast forward to a moment when a bipartisan group of members of the United States Senate, including one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, got together, came up with the border security bill. Well, guess what happened? Donald Trump got word that this bill was afoot and could be passed, and he wants to run on a problem instead of fixing a problem. So he told buddies in Congress, quote, kill the bill. Don't let it move forward, unquote. We already broke down that bill, and it wasn't about securing the border. They spent $70 billion in aid to Ukraine, sprinkled billions of dollars to other foreign countries, and only $20 billion was spent on border security. It wasn't a border security bill, and that's why Republicans in Congress rejected it, and Donald Trump is the loudest voice in the party, so of course he voiced his opinion about it. But dig deeper into the narrative Harris is painting. So Harris is suggesting that if it weren't for Trump, Republicans in Congress would have supported the bill, right? So they genuinely thought the bill would crack down on illegal immigration. Okay, so if they genuinely thought that, Harris is suggesting that they would go against a comprehensive plan that cracks down on border crossings, which they fiercely speak out about, and just abandon everything because the big bad wolf in Trump demanded they not support it. It's ridiculous, and it shows how dishonest and slimy Harris is in trying to gaslight the American people. It's like saying the massive illegal immigration over the last 3 years is actually Trump's fault, although he wasn't in office. You see this shit? Harris's lack of accountability is a red flag to the American voters because it indicates that she does not have integrity. Corrupt politicians don't have the ability to acknowledge their mistakes, their bad decisions, their bad policies. They point the finger elsewhere. The question is presented as such: if this crackdown has been so effective at this point, why wasn't it enforced back in 2021? Stop right here. Stop everything and put the high beams on Harris's face. Whitaker stops her from addressing the border security bill. He stops her from throwing Trump into the equation. He focuses directly on 2021 and this administration's lack of concern. And even more devastating, focusing on Harris specifically as the border czar. Where can she go? Who can she blame? Where does her finger point to? You end up with someone who is incapable of holding herself and her boss accountable, which leads to a brain fart. In other words, the teleprompter malfunctioned. The producers yell, cut. Let's see if we can salvage the interview. Vice President Harris, are you willing to continue? I think I've given you guys enough for today. This is the Chaos Sector.